All right, so we are all old enough here that we know that the internet is basically an STD. Which one it is, I don't really know. All of them, basically. Take your pick, whatever. Point is, you want to do everything possible in your power to protect yourself while you're out there surfing the web so you don't wind up having to spend your gas money on antibiotics. And that's where today's sponsor, Aura, comes in. Yeah, y'all already know what time it is. This is the part where the awkward pause and wink comes in, but it's late and the Eagles lost, man. I don't care. Or alerts you when your personal info has been leaked onto the dark web and gives you fast fraud alerts of anyone trying to access your accounts. They'll also remove your info from any data broker sites so you'll get less of those BS spam calls and scammer emails. So use my link aura.com/Lil Bill and get 14 days free, or just click on the link in the description below. Again, that's aura.com/Lil Bill, and put a hat on it, homie, for all of our sakes. When you hear the phrase civil rights movement, it likely conjures images of middle-aged black clergymen walking arm in arm as they lead a mass of men, women, and children of all races, religions, and regions, singing any one of a number of old Negro spirituals as they cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge and directly into a line of high-powered fire hoses and into the maws of the most racist breed of dog known to man. And I mean, they really should have seen that part coming. Like, German is right there in the name. Or if you are one of those hashtag educated blacks like myself, then you probably think of an army of unpaid student volunteers representing any one of the big three or like four alphabet orgs of the civil rights era, leaving their dorms for the Mississippi Delta to organize sit-ins, freedom rides, and voter registration campaigns before getting their left butt cheek chewed off by the most southern breed of dog known to man. And also shot, obviously. But what if I told you that the story of civil rights for black Americans has as much to do with carbines and sawed-offs as it does boycotts and ballot boxes? You probably say that this video is not going to get monetized, and more than likely you're right about that. In fact, what if I told you that armed resistance has been just as vital a component to the story of black liberation as nonviolent action, and for a much longer period of time at that? And what if I told you that this was as close to common knowledge among black folks until basically the 70s or so? Because, I mean, cocaine is a hell of a drug after all, and crack is the devil of them. And I don't know what that makes Fent. Probably Reagan, I guess, or Kissinger. Take your pick. My point is, despite popular mythology, the story of black liberation through armed defense, and some might even argue insurrection, didn't begin in Oakland, and it sure as shuckle didn't begin in the late 60s. And that's the journey we're going to take today. Sort of a crash course through the greatest lie ever told about the civil rights movement besides Jesse Jackson's importance to it. And perhaps more importantly, why that lie was told in the first place, and why until like the last decade-ish, no one really thought to push back against it. And most of all, what if anything there is for us to learn besides never trust anything with German in the name. Like I alluded earlier, the history of black armed resistance in America goes all the way back to the colonial period. But as has become something of a catchphrase on this channel, we ain't get to that part, bucko. Rather, for the sake of our story, we're going to start at the tail end of what's, in my opinion, and a lot of other people's, the most misunderstood and understudied period of American history aside from the pre-white folks period, Reconstruction. Specifically, I want to use one story to illustrate the role that armed resistance did play when it did play a role, and how if that role had continued, then we probably wouldn't have needed the civil rights movement or Martin and Medgar, among others, to become martyrs for it. Part of the reason I say Reconstruction is the most misunderstood period of American history is because it was unequivocally the most productive period for black interest until like a century later, and arguably beyond that. At the beginning of 1867, no blacks had held public office in the South to that point, but by the end of that decade, 15% of political offices were held by black people, a greater share than in 1990. In Mississippi, between 1870 and 76, 112 black state senators were elected to office, along with 2 U.S. senators and 1 U.S. congressman. In South Carolina, 190 black state senators were elected and 6 U.S. congressmen in that same period. In fact, the percentage of black delegates to the 1867 state constitutional conventions for South Carolina and Louisiana, respectively, were 61 and 64%. In fact, during this period, the southern states combined elected 633 black state senators, 2 U.S. senators, and 15 U.S. congressmen. But unlike 2008 and this year, the importance of these black legislators to black identity actually did go further than just skin deep. And yes, that shot was aimed squarely at the Jack and Jillians in the audience. For example, Mississippi's state constitution of 1868 granted state citizenship to all people who lived within the state borders, along with universal male suffrage, the establishment of that state's public school system, the elimination of segregation in public institutions, and the abolition of slavery in that state. Because yeah, they really did have to do that like 3 or 4 times. This is Mississippi in the 19th century after all. What'd you expect? One of the people instrumental in drafting that legislation was Charles Caldwell, who was elected as a delegate to the state constitutional convention that created the 68 Constitution. Almost definitely not by coincidence, Caldwell was attacked by the son of a white Mississippi judge a few weeks later, and Caldwell shot him in self-defense. Now again, this is Mississippi in the 19th century. The only place more dangerous for a black man is the Kardashian household, and I swear to God, Get Out is low-key a biopic about that family. My point is, y'all kind of already know how this story ends, right? Except it didn't end that way. Just like Get Out. See, y'all gotta pay attention. There's layers to these jokes, man. Y'all been listening to Drake for too long. Get your critical thinking skills up. Caldwell became the first black man on record to shoot a white man and be acquitted by an American court, making him the inaugural entrant into the Real Nigga Hall of Fame. But more importantly, Caldwell was one of those 100 and something state senators I mentioned earlier, being elected in 1870. In fact, by 1873, black men held the offices of lieutenant governor, secretary of state, superintendent of education, and speaker of the House in Mississippi. In response, white supremacists, most of which were former Confederate soldiers or at least Confederate sympathizers, worked to undermine the new black state government by doing what white folks do best, and that's violence. And yeah, both history and the FBI will co-sign that, by the way. So go either cry about it or do better, Jimothy. The 4chan is sitting right there for you, or I guess Twitter at this point, whatever. A slew of race riots occurred in Mississippi in 1875, including one incident where Caldwell was shot at during a public debate. In response, the black citizens and white allies in the state demanded that the state provide black people with arms to defend themselves from white rage. In response to that, then Governor Adelbert Ames authorized the creation of 7 state militia that were comprised of blacks and sympathetic whites, placing none other than Charles Caldwell in command of one of those militia. On October 9th, 1875, Caldwell led a combined militia into the state capital of Jackson on an arms run to the Republican capital. I don't know why I said capital twice. When the pro-Democrat white forces blockading the city saw the armed militia, they had no choice but to back down and go home with their tails tucked betwixt their ball sacks. The reason I brought that part up is because a month prior, the state Supreme Court ruled that the state could not supply arms to the militiamen. 5 days prior to Caldwell's march, Governor Ames disbanded the militias, leaving the white supremacists free to terrorize the black and white Republicans with impunity. This run would be the last triumph of Caldwell's tenure because in the midst of growing violence, he, along with a friend and several other black men near his home, were killed on Christmas night that same year by white terrorists. The story of Charles Caldwell symbolizes why we don't talk about Reconstruction, and more important for our story, even less about black armed resistance. The story of America, especially in its first 100 or so years, is one of steady progress, or at least that's what our national mythology says it is. The indomitable American spirit and all of that, or whatever. But Reconstruction kind of derails that whole narrative because you can't learn, let alone talk about this period and not wonder what could have been, especially if you're black. What makes it more damning is that there's literally no good reason the South set the reset button on itself without even bothering the scum save other than fragile white masculinity. Like, that's literally it. Every other policy or social issue of this period comes back to white folks, specifically those from the planter class, feeling salty about losing their Negroes. And again, that just don't jive with the melting pot myth that made America the land of make-believe for model minorities until the Bush years. The other part is the primary issue that has existed with black armed resistance since basically its birth: retaliation. In the years following Reconstruction, black people were dissuaded from forming any sort of paramilitary force for defense, let alone civil rights, because of the way they'd seen white people act during Reconstruction. This is the era in which domestic terror groups like the Red Shirts, the Klan, and the Pale Face Brotherhood were formed. And I swear to God, I did not make that last one up, but I kind of sort of wish I did. And they were formed explicitly to reassert the primacy of white people, specifically men, in a society that quite literally said that their way of life was now obsolete. This was the antebellum South's fight or flight response, so to speak. And what they feared was black people with rights, let alone arms, and what that meant to not just their way of life, but their lives themselves. So they reacted accordingly. That said, just because there were no black paramilitary groups during this period didn't mean armed resistance just stopped altogether. Quite the opposite, in fact. Instances of armed resistance in this period were primarily spontaneous and of a defensive nature. One of the most noteworthy examples involved a sharecropper named Joe Pullen. According to one account, Pullen got into an argument with his landlord over a $50 debt. When the landlord arrived for the money, Pullen just jawed at him with his hands tucked in his pockets. The landlord, taking this as a sign of disrespect, demanded that Pullen take his hands out of his pockets, which Pullen did, pulling out a handgun in the process and shooting his landlord through the chest and killing him, at which point he probably heard the music from that JoJo meme playing in the hills somewhere. Anyway, Pullen fled to his mother's house and grabbed a .38 and a shotty and hid in a ditch before ambushing a posse of 100 white men and chasing them, killing anywhere from 6 to 13 and wounding up to another 26, depending upon which account you believe, before the posse called in reinforcements from the neighboring county, including the sheriff, who brought with him a Browning frickin' machine gun, while other members of the posse brought automatic rifles. According to historian Akinyele Omowale Omoja, the author of We Will Shoot Back, the fight lasted 7 hours before Pullen was finally killed. His body dragged across the county as a warning to any other uppities to know their place, and his ear cut off and preserved in alcohol as a trophy. And yeah, I don't know, man, if this is a victory lap to be taken after 26 of my homies got capped by one dude. That sounds like a solid L to me. Pullen became something of a local legend to the blacks in the region, with Fannie Lou Hamer even recounting how the dispute all started from Pullen keeping the money his landlord gave him to hire more workers as back pay for unpaid work, and that the landlord was the one who actually shot first. Now, as positively badass as this story is, the immediate aftermath is exactly what I was talking about why these things didn't happen as often or on a larger scale. Strict curfews were enforced on blacks in the town where the incident took place. And in one incident, the sheriff killed 7 or 8 blacks for just crossing the street after curfew. That said, the longer lasting impact was that, in Hamer's words, it was a while in Mississippi before whites tried pulling something like that again. In fact, Pullen's story didn't stay in the Delta, but it reached the ears of King Black Capitalism himself, Marcus Garvey. And during the UNI International Convention of 1924, Garvey presided over a session titled Lynching and How to Correct It. Now, lynching was nothing new to blacks living north of the Mason-Dixon. I'm sure y'all have seen pictures of that NAACP flag before, and if you haven't, you've at least seen the corporate sponsor-friendly version on your rich auntie's BLM merchandise. But it wasn't as, for lack of better phrasing, real as it was for folks in the South. The primary method of pushback for national orgs, the NAACP specifically, was and still is litigation, which is a big reason why the NAACP was practically non-existent in the South until after World War II, just like indoor plumbing. The UNIA, however, did manage to carve out a little bit of a niche in the rural South before the war. A big reason why was their ideology. Garvey might have been the first person of his stature to articulate a concept that we would call today interest convergence, or maybe it was Du Bois. I don't really know. I'm not getting into the weeds with all that. My point is, Garvey was very skeptical of white liberals, but he was even more suspicious of white leftists because he believed that black allyship was just a means to and for white allies to reach their own ends, and that they would betray the interest of blacks as soon as those ends were fulfilled. And that's if their ideology even considered the racial component of oppression at all. And I mean, I did to like a whole 90-minute video about that like a year or two ago. So yeah, if I still had it, this would be the part where I put the Kente hat on. Edit one on for me, please. Therefore, Garvey didn't support integration, much less assimilation into white society, but he advocated for self-actualization of black people through self-reliant enterprise. So yeah, every just by black brother and sister you ever met is low-key a Garveyite, even if they don't realize it. And I mean, again, he wasn't completely wrong about black identity. He was just wrong about using capitalism to get there. But this ain't that video. Again, I've done that already as well. My point is, Garveyism ultimately boils down to black people should do whatever is best for black people, irrespective of non-black interest or even just non-black sensibilities. And this jived a lot more with Southern blacks than the NAACP's policy of integration through litigation. And it was that demonstratively pro-black ideology that made armed defense a viable option for Garveyites, especially in the South. During that special session, several UNIA members argued to organize in the same way that white supremacists had in the South, using UNIA chapters regionally and globally as communication networks to mobilize blacks against incidents of white supremacist violence. Basically, what they wanted was to do the Black Panther Party like 40 years earlier and in denim overalls. Now, nothing like that ever really came to fruition, but it already kind of dispels the narrative of the college-educated Yankees coming to the South with suitcase and picket sign in hand to fight on behalf of the meek and mild-mannered country niggas who couldn't so much as look a white man in the eye, let alone fight their own battles against them. Matter of fact, if it wasn't for those country niggas and their boomsticks, the high society blacks would have probably got popped before they could get off the Greyhound, to keep it a buck. Despite the ever-present specter of white retaliation, black GIs in the South returning from both world wars and Korea were not only stunned by the love they received overseas, but emboldened by their service to demand the same respect that they got over there in their own backyard. This facilitated a more militant opposition to white supremacy than what had been common in decades prior. And We Will Shoot Back, the book that I mentioned earlier and pulled probably the bulk of my information and sources from for this video, Umoja talks about the role that Southern black mythology played and even still plays in black resistance to white supremacy, using the dichotomy of the bad Negro and Br'er Rabbit. The bad Negro is pretty self-explanatory, so I won't expound too much on it. It's Nat Turner, it's Marcus Garvey, it's Malcolm, it's Huey, it's Kwame, Angela, Asada, Joe Pullen even. It's the Negro who isn't scared to get right in Jethro's face and tell him what time it is, openly defying society's expectation to humbly submit to the white man's whims and sensibilities. Every black wants to be a bad Negro. We celebrate them privately, even when we chastise them publicly, even if a lot of what they think and say is problematic, to keep it a buck. See Farrakhan, Lewis. Sorry, Hoteps. But that's the rub, isn't it? Everybody can't be a bad Negro because the bad Negro gets canceled. They get whipped, they get jailed, they get killed. Most aren't even really acknowledged during their time, much less rewarded by those outside of their own interest group. They don't get elected to national office. Bad Negroes don't get multi-million-dollar record and movie deals. They don't get sponsorships from a certain streaming platform that shall remain nameless. Did I really say that out loud? I guess I ain't getting it now. They're the martyrs of the struggle, but the problem with martyrs is they never get to fulfill their potential because society makes it their business to make examples out of them. Somebody needs to live to see that the work gets done. And sometimes that means, in the words of historian and civil rights activist Charles Cobb, a head scratch and a shuffle, a feint of consolation or even ineptitude. And that's what Br'er Rabbit is. Br'er Rabbit is, in a lot of ways, a survival of trickster characters from West African folklore like Anansi the Spider, for example. He is the definition of brain over brawn in that he uses guile and wit to overcome more physically powerful and imposing foes. The stories of Br'er Rabbit parallel the kind of nonviolent resistance practiced by slaves and even many freedmen in the South. Seemingly small things like moving a step slower than what you're capable during the workday, accidentally losing or even breaking tools. These are examples of the kind of resistance commonly practiced by black folks in the antebellum South and even postbellum. And like Br'er Rabbit, the black Southerners who created him used the oppressor's hubris against them to get away with these acts relatively unscathed. Because of course you can't pick that cotton as quick as a white man could, boy. And of course you forgot where you put the hoe and trowel. And of course you ran that wheelbarrow into that very conveniently placed gopher hole that looks suspiciously man-made when I think about it. You can't expect much out of these Negroes, don't you know, Jethro? This was the best way to get one up on the white man without reprisal before the world wars. But the thing is, after the wars, there were a lot more bad Negroes than what whites and even blacks had grown accustomed to. And to articulate this, let me tell you the story of TRM Howard. Howard was a doctor, an entrepreneur, and much later, an activist whose life really illustrates how the idea of what black nationalism meant was evolving in the civil rights era. Howard initially was low-key a Garveyite, even if he didn't know it, focusing his energy on bringing opportunities to his small corner of black America as opposed to any direct action against white supremacy, by establishing a bunch of businesses and hiring black people while also serving as the chief surgeon of the Knights of Tabor Hospital in Mound Bayou, Mississippi. Well, one of these businesses was an insurance company where a young Medgar Evers was employed, but say it with me, kids. We ain't get there yet. Despite his initial commitment to separatism, one could even argue segregationism, Howard's politics became much more directed toward the white power structure due to the increase of racially motivated violence against blacks in and around Mound Bayou, especially black politicians and civil rights activists. This led Howard to establish the Regional Council of Negro Leadership, the RCNL, in 1951. Which orchestrated a number of successful boycotts against white businesses that refused to service blacks, as well as voter registration campaigns that wound up registering 20,000 new black voters by 1954. The yearly RCNL rallies attracted a who's who of black activists and celebrities, including Thurgood Marshall, Mahalia Jackson, and Chicago politician William Dawson. But of course, too many uppity Negroes in one place didn't sit too well with the local whites, which led to enough violent outbursts that Howard decided it was time to pull out the hammers. His reputation reached the national spotlight when in August of 1955, Emmett Till was murdered by a bunch of dickheaded inbreds, and Howard, wary of white authorities' motivation to do their jobs, took on the task of investigating the murder himself. His home during this time was described by visitors as, quote, a black command center, replete with any number of weapons and ammunition, including a Tommy gun that he kept at the foot of his bed, as he hosted journalists, state representatives, and even Mamie Till herself. Howard even personally escorted Miss Till from Chicago to Mississippi in a, quote, heavily armed caravan. Alas, as we all know, the efforts were all in vain, as the inbred hicks who killed Till and the gutter snipe who falsely accused him all got away with it for most, if not the rest of their lives. As a result, Howard and his family were frequently subject of death threats and even attacks on their home, to the point that he was effectively exiled out of Mississippi not too long after the trial. But that didn't stop his activism or even political aspirations. Howard was still a vocal critic of the state for its failure to protect civil rights, and was a prominent figure in Chicago public society, where he fled when he left Mississippi, even running for Congress in 1958 against William Dawson as a Republican. And that's really the thing I want to harp on with Howard. We often have this image of civil rights as a wholly left-wing affair, and I don't know, maybe it was for white folks, but for blacks and even browns, it was more complicated than that, as life and people outside of the internet usually are most times. Howard was a very vocal critic of socialism, saying he wished, quote, one bomb could be fashioned that could blow every communist in America right back to Russia where they belong. The nigga even caped for Jefferson at one point, which, I mean, ill nigga. Still, his absolute disdain for far left politics didn't stop him from doing what was in the best interest of black Americans as he saw it, being one of the first contributors to Jesse Jackson's Operation Breadbasket and being the finance chair of Push in its early days. Now, side-eye to Jesse aside, the point is, ideologically speaking, these initiatives were very obviously left-wing, and Howard was smart enough to know that, but that didn't stop him from reaching across the aisle, because there's commies over there, don't you know? But that's kind of where Howard's part in this story ends, and where Medgar Evers's begins, or actually it begins like 20 years earlier, I guess, because he was already gone by the time Push came to be. Whatever, y'all understand what I'm saying. We moving on to the next section. Remember how I talked about all those bad Negroes that came back from the war? Yeah, Medgar and his brother Charles were two of those Negroes. They, along with several other black GIs, attempted to register to vote at the local county courthouse, where they were met by a mob of angry whites. But instead of just turning tail and going home, they went home and got their boomsticks, before ultimately deciding it wasn't worth it when the crowd at the courthouse got even larger and brought even bigger guns. Like I said earlier, Medgar was hired by TRM Howard as an insurance agent upon completing his degree, but more importantly, Medgar became a protege of Howard's, like Fannie Lou Hamer and, again, Jesse Jackson much later on. Again, obligatory side-eye aside. Medgar used the skills he learned as a salesman to begin organizing blacks in the area for demonstrations and voter registration campaigns. And this success led to he being named president of the RNLC. But just like trap brunches and hot hood yoga, once the poor folks made it safe, the bougie blacks finally came down from their ivory towers and into the trenches to mingle with the huddled, unwashed masses until the street lights and Blackish came on. That's when the NAACP snatched up Medgar in 1954 and appointed him as Mississippi's first field secretary for that org. Again, Mississippi was a no-go for anybody who wasn't already there, until people like Howard, Hamer, and Medgar had already done the work to make it safe to do all that nonviolent stuff that the movement would become synonymous with. During this time, Evers succeeded in getting Mississippi in the national spotlight through nonviolent efforts like boycotts and sit-ins. But behind the scenes, he was much more militant than people knew, or at least people outside of the org knew. See, Evers had studied and was inspired by the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya to form his own guerrilla army of black insurgents to bring greater attention to racial injustice in Mississippi. Now, I don't have the time to get into all of that. I know Feeks talked about the Mau Mau's already in the Bamboozled video, and I feel like Anansi might have made a video about them too, and if not, they probably got something cooking as we speak. But TLDR, the Mau Mau's didn't really win. Quite the opposite, in fact. But the cost of continued warfare and the public attention brought to the oppressive colonial regime in Kenya by that rebellion was enough to at least start the transition from a colonial government to an independent Kenya. And that's what Evers wanted his hypothetical paramilitary outfit to do. So basically exactly what the common mythology says the civil rights movement set out to do, but instead of appealing to white sympathy exclusively, Evers' plan focused on morality and pragmatism. Even if you didn't feel sorry for the blacks, you could at least see how stupid it was to keep fighting over a public toilet, especially when it costs you millions of tax dollars to do so. But then again, this is the South during Jim Crow. We're not exactly talking about a bunch of Rhodes Scholars here. Point I'm getting at is I don't know if Medgar was right, and no one ever will, because he was ultimately dissuaded by the bougie blacks at National HQ. The NAACP had taken a hard line against any form of even talk of armed resistance, to the point that they actually showed up to the FBI headquarters and encouraged the feds to investigate blacks who did advocate for such, including NAACP members and leaders. And I mean, you got to wonder how many times they were waking up in the night to see how far those dark circles around the eyes had spread, right? Hey, all I'm saying is if it walked like a duck, if it quacked like a duck, ain't a goose, bucko. Point is, Evers' public stance on armed resistance was more a product of pressure than of his own personal ideology. Evers, like many of the alphabet org workers who actually spent time in the trenches, became much more sympathetic to the ideals of the locals the more time they spent around them. Because like I alluded earlier, a coordinated campaign of nonviolent direct action did not become the preferred method of resistance until after the Montgo bus boycott. That was the ram in the bush that the national orgs needed, because they could now push nonviolence as not only the preferred, but the only effective method of resistance. But why though? Most of y'all already know what I'm going to say, but because I like to hear myself talk, we'll talk about it anyway. It was white people, white liberals specifically. I'd even argue exclusively, because the thing is backward as the inbreds were, one thing they didn't really have a problem with was black gun ownership. At least not when it was too late to matter to their own interests. They didn't have a problem with it. And that's because if there's one thing more American than racism, it's gun culture. The gunslinger and ergo the gun is inextricable from the American mythos. It's our version of the samurai or the European knight. It's symbolic of the things Americans have historically valued most: independence, self-reliance, white supremacists, expansionism, you know what I'm saying. Think about those old-timey black and white westerns. The hero is more often than not a lone gunman set against a horde of angry natives, but the movie never really bothers to explain why the natives are angry to begin with, but this ain't that video. One man, one gun, and one great big set of cojones, exacting some good old frontier justice on the ones who wronged him. That is the American way. Even outlaws like Jesse James, Billy the Kid, you can even throw John Dillinger in there, are depicted as anti-heroes more than they are outright villains. If for no other reason, then you gotta admit, there is something noble, even admirable, about a man and his gun standing 10 toes down against the seemingly overwhelming force of the ops, especially if the op is an oppressor. But only if that man is white. And that, I think, is the reason why the story of black armed resistance has been largely relegated to videos like these and the books that inspired them. Even today, matter of fact, I say even more so today, just the thought of black people with arms evokes anxiety, even fear in the average American, partly because historical anti-blackness conditions us to associate blackness with crime and ergo violence, but more so, in my opinion, because white people's fear of reprisal for centuries worth of oppression. Historically, white Americans' greatest fear was of the tables being turned on them, of the blacks and the Indians, and to a lesser extent, the browns and the Asians getting a hold of the guillotine, so to speak. And again, you can't really blame them for that. I mean, Haiti did happen after all. And the more removed from our pastoral past we've become, the less of a direct connection to gun culture most of us have now. So the urbane whites, most of whom were in the North, most of whom became, and if we're going to be real, still are basically reliant on the state, as most of us in urban and suburban America are at this point, just couldn't comprehend why a civilized human being would ever need a gun. But the country folk did. I think this is no better illustrated than in a story Charles Cobb tells about Mr. Joe, a local black farmer who he and his comrades stayed with for a time during Freedom Summer. The story goes that Mr. Joe had marched down to the local sheriff's office to retrieve his confiscated firearm after Cobb had showed him in a history book that he had a constitutional right to that arm. And much to the amazement and relief of the young SNCC workers, Mr. Joe didn't come back with his head hanging from the saddle of the horse carrying his lifeless body, but he came back in his own pickup truck with his rifle raised triumphantly above his head. There's a part of me that thinks that this was part of the motivation for Medgar's guerrilla group. But again, we will never know because the higher ups assumed that they knew better than Medgar about his own home state and the culture that defined it. Nonviolence didn't fly with most of the Southern blacks, and even when it did prove effective, most just accepted its efficacy and continued on as they had been for a century plus, basically. There is even an argument that had the NAACP not been so dogmatic about nonviolence, then Medgar would have never died the way he did, considering that this was the one night he had no security detail. But again, that's not really the point. The point is that in the South, at least, the situation was much more complicated than history often remembers it. Even the SNCC and core students who had been indoctrinated with nonviolence began to change their tune once the brutality of Deep South racism was put on full display. And even the ones who didn't couldn't deny that they benefited from the regular display of force from time and again. Some SNCC members challenged the nonviolent philosophy, examples being the Young Turks of the National Student Movement acting as armed security during a demonstration in Nashville. SNCC workers in Danville, Virginia were protected by black snipers from the local black population. In Walthall County, Mississippi, SNCC organizers attempted to organize and register blacks to vote in that region. The organizers were told by locals about brothers who had deterred night riders from terrorizing the black populace in Tylertown. After being warned multiple times to stop by the black populace, one of the white night riders was captured during one of their raids. His head was cut off and put on display on the bridge separating the white and black parts of town. And after this, no white person crossed the bridge unless on official business. And when they did so with the utmost respect for the local populace. Yeah, more entries into the Real Nigga Hall of Fame. And I think it's important here to point out that none of this was done by an organized paramilitary outfit. It was just country niggas being country. Haven towns like Tylertown, Harmony, and Meridian, Mississippi were integral to establishing a presence for the national orgs. But these havens would have never become havens if not for armed resistance and the informal lines of communication that already existed, like that fraternal order of brothers that I talked about earlier, and also clubs. Furthermore, we have more than a handful of examples of direct armed resistance actually proving effective in not just standing, but gaining ground in the civil rights fight. Robert F. Williams was the president of the Monroe, North Carolina chapter of the NAACP. He was exceptional during that time in that he openly advocated for armed resistance as opposed to nonviolence. Williams led the campaign to integrate the public library and then swimming pools of that town. During these demonstrations, protesters were fired upon by KKK members, which prompted Williams to apply to the NRA for a local chapter charter. This chapter became known as the Black Armed Guard and would organize patrols around the area to deter white supremacist violence. In 1957, a rumor began that the Klan planned to attack Monroe NAACP VP Albert Perry. Williams responded by mobilizing the Black Armed Guard to fortify Perry's house with sandbags and to defend it. Klan members did attack the home, but were deterred by Williams and his men. After this incident, the city officials called an emergency meeting in which the Klan was thereafter officially banned from Monroe. At the time, the press estimated that 7,500 of the city's 12,000 residents were Klan members. So, yeah, efficacy, man. Williams' philosophy he relays in his book Kneegrows with Guns, which was published in 1963.
Racists consider themselves superior beings and are not willing to exchange their superior lives for our inferior ones. They are most vicious and violent when they can practice violence with impunity.
And agree or disagree with his methods, you can't really say that it didn't work again. But you know what he got in return? A suspension from his post in 1959, a warrant for his arrest in 61, and exile to Cuba the same year, where he continued to advocate for his form of black resistance through the Radio Free Dixie broadcast, which a whole book has already been written about and a movie should be made about, honestly. Another example is that of 86-year-old Janie Brewer, who opened her home to SNCC and Corps members, including Margaret Block, who tells this story.
Mrs. Brewer asked me, what did SNCC mean? And I told her, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And she stopped me. She said, you said nonviolent. If somebody come at you, you ain't gonna do nothing? She pulled up a big old rifle. Mrs. Brewer said, shit, we ain't nonviolent.
Mrs. Brewer's sons had attempted to register to vote at the county courthouse, but evidently things went sideways at some point, as they are wont to do in the South during the 60s. Mrs. Brewer instructed her sons and the SNCC organizers to wait in the nearby cotton fields with shotguns and rifles at the ready, waiting for night riders to arrive. Meanwhile, she was busy in the kitchen teaching Margaret how to cook up Molotov cocktails. And when the sheriff and Klansmen showed up and showed a floodlight onto the house, Janie was standing on the front porch with a cocktail cocked back, waiting to throw it at the truck. And as Block reports, everyone, including the sheriff, fled. Night riders never returned to the Brewer farm. After the bombing of a home belonging to a local activist, Aileen Quinn, the black citizens of Macomb, Mississippi, took up arms and prowled the streets for days looking for some get back. LBJ personally called the Mississippi governor at the time and threatened to send federal troops to Macomb. The governor contacted the Pike County DA, and within 24 hours of the governor and Pike County DA convening, Klansmen were being arrested for not just that bombing, but many, many more that had taken place previously. By the next week, 11 Klansmen had been arrested for past bombings in Macomb and the Aileen Quinn bombing. The national attention that Macomb received gave it the reputation of bombing capital of America. White business owners decided that the reputation that they had got was bad for business, and they pushed for tolerance of the black folks, if for no other reason than to keep their pockets from developing a hole at the bottom. One overarching theme here, and one that exists in freedom struggles to this day, is that the immediacy of oppression makes ideology much less a priority than results. What I'm saying is, in my time doing actual honest to God direct action, I've learned that dogma is a luxury only afforded to those most detached from the struggle. Damn, that was a bar, man. Again, Freedom Summer was made possible not through the genius of the national body's public platform, but by regular people like you and me cooperating, even if they didn't always agree, even if they didn't fit the mold that the media felt was most presentable. One of these people was Hartman Turnbow. Turnbow was an ally to the civil rights organizers in the Mississippi Delta during Freedom Summer, even if he wasn't necessarily an organizer himself. Turnbow was just a dude, an independent farmer in Chula, Mississippi, doing his part to help the cause and doing it on his own terms. In 1964, Turnbow attempted to register to vote at the Holmes County Courthouse along with 13 other blacks, becoming known as the First 14. In the midst of a white mob, the county sheriff put his hand on his gun holster, saying, "Who'll be the first?" To which Turnbow replied, "Me, nigga. Got a problem?" Well, no, I'm paraphrasing. What he actually said was, "Me, Hartman Turnbow. I came here to die to vote." Again, real nigga Hall of Fame. Despite not succeeding that day, the First 14, along with the blacks in that region, were emboldened, and Turnbow became the figurehead of the movement. A month later, Turnbow's home was firebombed, and he ran out the house with his rifle and was attacked by white supremacists. Turnbow shot back at the attackers, running them off before returning to his wife and 2 daughters in the burning home. They then spent the rest of the morning attempting to put that fire out. In April 1964, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party was formed, and Turnbow was elected to represent that party as a delegate to the 64 Democratic National Convention, where he gave account of his own run-ins with white supremacists, including that firebombing I mentioned earlier. The thing about Turnbow, though, is even if he wasn't allied to the nonviolent movement, he didn't need or want to adopt their ideology to support their cause. Famously saying once to Martin Luther King himself, "This nonviolent stuff ain't no good. It'll get you killed." Which, I mean, bet. Probably the most colorful and my personal favorite character from this period is C.O. Chinn, a local businessman in the same sense as J. Prince. Chinn was integral in protecting civil rights organizers in Canton, Mississippi, or at least the town and the surrounding area. His wife, Minnie Lou, was much more directly involved in activist efforts, organizing teenagers to distribute clothes and food to the impoverished. Chinn's reputation allowed for him to operate his, let's call them less than legal businesses, largely undisturbed by the local sheriff, so long as that sheriff got a cut of the profit. Chinn was said to be so feared by most of the whites in Canton that one story says that he laughed when a deputy tried to arrest him, saying that only the sheriff could take him in. And even when the deputy did go and get the sheriff didn't just lock him up immediately. He offered Chinn a fist fight. This was their terms. If Chinn won, then he could go free. But if Chinn lost, he would have to go to jail. And this occurred several times, reportedly. 2-time real nigga Hall of Famer. Chinn's relationship with the sheriff soured when he began housing and protecting civil rights organizers from CORE. CORE even set up its Canton office across the street from Chinn's cafe, knowing the whites would be too scared to mess with them so close to a Chinn establishment. And the Chinn Family Club, Club Desire, was the site of twice weekly CORE meetings, and Chinn himself was often seen sitting in his pickup truck outside the local church where organizing meetings also took place, suited and booted up, of course.
I went outside to talk to him. He's sitting in the back of his truck with a shotgun across his lap and a pistol by his side. I introduced myself, told him about CORE's nonviolent philosophy. He listened. Then, very calmly, he told me, "This is my town, and these are my people. I'm here to protect my people, and even if you don't like this, I'm not going anywhere. So maybe you better leave."
In the summer of 1963, Chinn began working with civil rights organizers full-time in their effort to register local blacks to vote. Chinn's liquor license was revoked, obviously, and he was forced to close his cafe as a result. Nevertheless, this didn't preclude Chinn from, in his words, protecting his people. The day before marchers participating in James Meredith's March Against Fear were scheduled to arrive, a group of whites attempted to bomb the Mississippi Freedom House that was in Canton that I mentioned earlier. After Chinn and others chased the carload of bombers, he was accused of shooting one of the white men in the arm and was arrested for assault with a deadly weapon. He denied the charge but was found guilty in October of 66. But he was granted a retrial in 68 and again found guilty, but the decision was reversed because, real nigga again. However, in 1970, Chinn was found guilty of killing a different man, though Chinn asserted that he had shot him in self-defense. Chinn wound up being sentenced to 20 years in the Mississippi State Penitentiary and served time before his release in the late 1970s. In light of the demonstrated efficacy of armed resistance, orgs like SNCC and CORE's positions on nonviolence were challenged both within and without the organization, with many of the younger organizers adapting their personal philosophies to match that of their elder allies like Brewer, Turnbow, and Chinn. And these are just a handful of examples of the kind of collaboration that made Freedom Summer possible. And you notice how in all of these stories, these were just regular everyday folk doing their part to make the cause possible, right? It wasn't some grand ideological narrative that motivated them to action, even when they did become more organized. Around this same time period, a nameless black paramilitary group formed under the command of Rudy Shields in Natchez, Mississippi, largely in response to an assassination attempt against Natchez NAACP President George Metcalf. This attack left Metcalf's both his legs shattered and his right eye permanently damaged. By the beginning of the next year, the Natchez chapter, which had begun calling itself the Deacons for Defense, even though it technically wasn't officially affiliated with the Louisiana-based group that we will come back to, so chill out in the comments, was patrolling the streets and providing security for organizing events. The group was composed of two wings, a group of mostly middle-aged war vets who worked security detail, and the other an enforcer group made up of young teens and 20-somethings, which later became known as the Spirit. Kind of spooky. I like it. The Spirit's job was basically to, let's say, encourage the non-compliant Negroes to comply with boycotts on white-owned businesses. And I mean, based on the results, again, you can't say that the encouragement didn't work. Most of y'all who have stuck around to this point have probably at least heard of the Deacons for Defense. See, I told you I was going to come back to them, especially the Boogaloozah chapter, for which a whole movie has been made, so I won't really get into their history because that's not really the point in me bringing them up. But the Cliff Notes version is this was the largest and, more importantly, most visible black paramilitary group in the states until the Black Panthers. What made the Deacons so important is that in 1965, CORE co-founder and national director James Farmer, another black Republican by the way, publicly acknowledged a relationship between that org and the Deacons, signaling to the national media that their whole non-violent philosophy was a lot more fluid than they had led on to that point. In fact, after James Meredith was shot during the first attempt at his 300-mile march against fear, leaders of the national movement, including King, acknowledged the sensibility of having the Deacons on board as security, even if they did have reservations. This despite the national media often portraying the relationship between King and the Deacons as being openly contentious, which it wasn't really. In fact, a year after the deaths of James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Mickey Schwimmer, King took a contingent of black demonstrators to Philadelphia, Mississippi to commemorate the occasion. When they arrived, however, many who had never seen what racism in the rural South looked like were low-key startled by how vitriolic it was, as white counter-protesters threw rocks and even cherry bombs at them for just breathing. King called it off for a few days so that they could head to safety and regroup and replan. That same night, the Philadelphia Freedom House was attacked by night riders, but Ralph Featherstone, having adopted the meet violence with violence philosophy of Williams, Turnbow, Chinn et al., organized his comrades to return fire at the night riders. This incident helped propel Featherstone to national leadership later on, but again, it proves the point of how useless dogma is in the real world. King requested federal protection for a second attempt at the march 3 days later, and the day before the march was supposed to reach Philadelphia, the Canton Freedom House, where they were, was firebombed by night riders. And guess who was there to chase them off? That nigga C.O. Chinn. Yeah, this is the same incident I mentioned earlier for which he was tried and ultimately acquitted. And here we are basically at the end of the video. And the question must be asked, what really was the point besides the love of the game? Well, to tell you the truth, as again Umoja puts it, and I believe Cobb did as well, this video isn't really the story about black people with guns. The guns was just the hook to get you to pay attention to the real message. This was my attempt to push back against a few narratives, one or two that were made clear off jump, and a few I know a lot of y'all wouldn't stick around to listen to if I did this any other way, because that's discourse in the age of hot tours and big bang challenges. I can't speak for anybody else, but if it hadn't been for my Hotep family members, I probably would have grown up assuming, like most people, that civil rights succeeded where black power failed, because that's what always happens to bad Negroes. Matter of fact, you can say the same for basically every bad minority group. Their cause is worthy, but their methods are just ineffectual. You just can't get all up in masses' face and tell them what for and then expect things to change, because the number one rule of any revolution is to make sure that the white folks are comfortable with it first. Or any successful YouTube channel for that matter. The leaders of the civil rights movement, with a shuffle, a head scratch, and eyes pointed to the ground, stuck out their hands and asked as humbly and meekly as possible for the benevolent white liberals to save them from the big bad racists and be the supermen and women that they were always born to be. Yuck. But this is false on several accounts. For one thing, black power, even if it didn't have a name yet, was already firmly in the consciousness of young blacks by the end of Freedom Summer. Matter of fact, Kwame Ture's infamous speech where he articulated in no uncertain terms the ethos of black power happened during that same march where C.O. Chinn saved Martin from a premature murking. In fact, the argument can be made that black power existed in some form since at least Reconstruction, but that then begs the question, why didn't it succeed then? The feds, that's why. Well, also white fragility. I get so tired talking about white people, man. Remember how I said we come back to the colonial period? Well, I bet they didn't teach you that insurrections were happening all the time during the colonial period and even the days of the early republic. In fact, according to historian Herbert Aptheker, between 1619 and 1865, more than 250 insurrections of slaves and or indentured servants occurred, probably the most consequential being Bacon's Rebellion. The details of how and why it happened aren't really important to our story. Matter of fact, the immediate outcome isn't either. But what is that this wasn't just a slave rebellion. It was a working class one, a multiracial one. And that scared the powdered wigs off the ruling class. You got to remember, this is the early days of North American chattel slavery. So the racial caste system that would define it wasn't codified the way that it was by the time we got to the American Civil War. Not only that, but the colonies were becoming exponentially darker as new slaves were arriving on the trade block every single day. That isn't to say that racism didn't exist, because it most definitely did, but it wasn't, again, codified the way that it would be after this and until the 50s and 60s. So in response, the planter class basically invented the concept of poor white trash, using the same divide and conquer methods of the empires of antiquity by giving the working whites just a smidge of power while systematically stripping free and enslaved Negroes of basically any and every human right imaginable, all the while gassing the working whites like Drake Stans did when push-ups came out.
I have rebellions in both Jamaica and Warren. We have already 10,000 men of these descendants of Ham fit to bear arms, and these numbers increase every day, as well by birth and by importation. And in case there shall arise a man exasperated by desperate fortune, he might with more advantage than Catiline invoke a servile war that will tinge our rivers wide as they are with blood.
In 1680, Virginia lawmakers sharply restricted black social gatherings and made it illegal for blacks to carry guns. The legislation also sanctioned whipping and killing of fugitive slaves and empowered any white person to do so, not just slave holders. In 1705, Virginia created slave codes that segregated whites and blacks regardless of social status, but especially white colonists from black slaves, making it practically impossible for those two groups to unite the way that they did during Bacon's Rebellion. By 1723, the law permitted the amputation or death of slaves for practically any reason. Black people were stripped of voting rights or the right to hold any public office or act as a witness against a white. And it also became illegal for any black person, free or enslaved, to hold, quote, any gun, powder, shot, or any club or any other weapon whatsoever, offensive or defensive. Which now brings us back to Reconstruction. Like I said off top, this period is probably the most misunderstood in American history because the stone cold truth about Reconstruction is that it didn't fail. It was undone. And the reason it was the sight of a black man with arms. Here's the thing. By the middle of the American Civil War, the number of white volunteers on both sides dwindled tremendously to the point that both sides kind of realized they were going to need to enlist some Negroes if they were going to win. But only one side had enough sense to do that while it still mattered. Hey, this is the South we talking about. By the end of the war, 10% of the Union forces were black, and coincidentally, like 20% of casualties, but that's not my point. Reconstruction actually technically began like 2 years before the war actually ended, when Lincoln realized that he was going to need a plan to reintegrate all the Rebs back into the Union. But he also knew this meant that the freedmen and women would need to be protected, or at least the Rebs would need to be, again, encouraged to comply with this new way of life. And I mean, it's not like the South hadn't spent the last 3 years fighting the whole freaking war for exactly that to not happen in the first place. Duh, nigga. What this meant was federal occupation. Remember how I said 1 out of every Union soldier during this time was a black man? Yeah, if you haven't put the pieces of the puzzle together, not only did the Rebs have to cope with the Yanks driving old Dixie down, not only did they have to cope with the anxiety of not knowing exactly what the Republican government was going to do to all of those Dixiecrats, not only did they have to cope with losing millions of free laborers, but those laborers were now the ones enforcing all of this change on them. Those shiftless, wide-nosed, big-butt-having jigaboos were the ones with the power now. And I know at least one Jethro had to contemplate offering himself over that. I'm not going to speak my true feelings on that. In fact, it's estimated that as much as a third of the federal troops stationed in the South during this time were black. The problem was the feds didn't commit to it, which is basically the story of black people in America in a nutshell. In 1865 alone, the number of federal troops in the South decreased from 1 million to 152,000 by the end of the year, and then down to 38,000 by the next year. And all this did was tell the inbreds that maybe slavery wasn't as over as they had been led to believe. Disarming black vets after the war became a priority in the South. Southern lawmakers demanded that black regiments be removed from the South during occupation. Matter of fact, one 1865 Mississippi law stated, quote, no freedman, free Negro, or mulatto, not in the service of the United States government and not licensed to do so by the board of police of his or her county, shall keep or carry firearms of any kind. Moral of the story being, biracials are black, you dumb mother. The message, even if unintentional, was loud and clear. All the inbreds had to do was click their heels 3 times, saddle up, and take the power back for themselves, because who was going to stop them? The Republicans. That's who. Just don't say that part out too loud. One of 3 Reconstruction Acts passed in 1867 authorized the creation of state militias comprised of black war vets to enforce civil rights. And there were black state militia regiments in the South into the 1870s. For example, martial law was declared in 14 Arkansas counties after the Klan was deemed responsible for over 200 murders after the ratification of that state's new constitution. The then Governor Powell Clayton authorized the state militia composed of white Union sympathizers and freedmen who apprehended, arrested, and yes, killed Klansmen. So yeah, Django was a biopic. The problem was, again, the feds never really committed to it, and even the ones who did really couldn't, because Andrew Jackson is a hillbilly cousin pumper, and I hope he is burning in hell right now, sitting on the blunt end of a hot metal stake. Anyway, no one can say for certain what definitely would have happened had the radical wing of the Republican Party had their own way, or even if Lincoln had, just not bit the bullet. That pun was not intended, but I'll take a dub when I can get it. Even if Lincoln hadn't bent the bullet for like another 6 more months. But what we do know is at EOD, everything Reconstructionists had fought for was overturned by and because of white terror. And more poignantly, because the federal government failed to respond in a way that had already proven efficacious with force, or at least with the threat of force. And this was the story that freed men and women told their children and their children's children. And the lesson taken from that was one of self-reliance, that it was up to black people to protect black people by any means necessary when necessary, whether that meant meeting violence with violence, or more often than not, just not making so much noise as to warrant such a response in the first place. Point being, black people were resisting white supremacy for as long as that became necessary. They just weren't doing so with the quote-unquote bigger picture in mind most times. And I mean, okay, can you really blame them for that? The feds had made it clear that protecting black interests was not a priority. So what option was there aside from, making a new separate society with blackjack and hookers? And yeah, my perspective admittedly is kind of colored by growing up in Hotep adjacency to some point. But even today, integration alone, if you ask me, is not enough. I believe it has its limits, specifically economic limits, which now brings us back to King. So here's the thing about Martin. His legacy is more whitewashed than tapered fades at this point. And yeah, that was by design, but I don't think it would have been possible if not for black militancy. Again, the goal of appealing to white morality is grossly overstated in its importance to the civil rights movement, even by those within and around it. The thing that people forget is just because they weren't throwing bows and stomping toes, the nonviolent organizers were just as, matter of fact, arguably more disruptive than the militants. The reason Mongo worked wasn't because white liberals felt bad about seeing their black co-workers walk to and from work until the soles of their shoes looked like a piece of parchment paper. It was because racism was literally costing the city way more money than it was worth to keep up. Even sit-ins disrupted the flow of commerce as much as they did pull on the heartstrings. Even King himself was not nearly as conciliatory as his nonviolent philosophy made him appear. Some of y'all probably already noticed, but King had applied for a concealed carry permit in 1956 and wound up being denied because, duh, nigga. But that didn't stop Martin from strapping up. Matter of fact, Glenn Smiley once described the King house as an arsenal before he and Bayer Russin wound up talking Martin down from keeping straps around. Because, the face of the nonviolent resistance movement with a blicky in his waistband, that ain't exactly the look you want to go for, you know what I mean? And this story has, again, been told ad nauseum at this point. And almost every time it's told, it is done so with a motive. This either to support arms ownership or to make the case against it. And consequently, key details about both the story and King himself wound up getting left out. Because despite popular mythology, King had pretty much given up any hope on white Southerners by the time the Civil Rights Act of 63 was signed. Instead, he was focusing his attention on northern white liberals by this point. But even then, his ideology was growing increasingly more radical, basically by the day, or at least publicly it was. Let me explain for a second. Even before Mongo thrust him into the national spotlight, King was already telling the ones closest to him that he personally believed capitalism had outlived its usefulness. But by the time the civil rights movement had moved from integration to economic freedom, he was becoming much more public and, dare I say, militant about it, to the point that he was using terms like class warfare, wealth redistribution, and most often of all, democratic socialism to describe his personal politics. King was also a very, very vocal detractor of the Vietnam War once he stopped caring about making white folks mad at him, which he did make them mad at him, to the point of becoming the most hated man in America, according to a 1963 Harris poll. Matter of fact, one of his last speeches reads like him low-key caping for the riots that had defined the long, hot summer of 1967.
As I've always said, and I will always continue to say, that riots are socially destructive and self-defeating. I'm still convinced that non-violence is the most potent weapon available to oppress people in their struggle for freedom and justice. But at the same time, it is as necessary for me to be as vigorous in condemning the conditions which cause persons to feel that they must engage in riotous activities as it is for me to condemn riots. I think America must see that riots do not develop out of thin air. Certain conditions continue to exist in our society, which must be condemned as vigorously as we condemn riots. But in the final analysis, a riot is the language of the unheard.
Something he wouldn't have even thought of doing publicly just 4 years earlier. Just like Reconstruction, though, it's impossible to know how King's philosophy would have evolved had he lived to see the disco decade. So I'm not trying to tell you that King was definitely a socialist or anything like that. Again, people are much more complicated than that. That's kind of the point of this video. But it's evident that he was growing increasingly disillusioned with white allies and consequently more forceful in his tone in politics. That's what the Poor People's Campaign was. It was, in his own words, Negroes coming to get their check. But again, King never lived to see it. And even if he did, who's to say that things would have turned out differently? Even today, 2/3 of Americans don't support any form of reparations legislation, despite we having more than the resources necessary to make it happen. Point I'm getting at is Garvey was right, even if halfway. Integration puts limitation on black liberation when that alone is the end goal instead of a means to that goal. Listen, I'm by no means a segregationist or even a separatist, despite, again, the willfully obtuse among y'all probably arguing against such in the comments, even as I speak. And again, I say have fun chasing your own tail. But what I am saying is, historically speaking, white allyship is limited by its whiteness. Like I said, I spent an hour and a half talking about this like 2 years ago, so I'm not doing it again. And that's not even my main point. Rather, it's that civil rights, or at least the civil rights movement, didn't succeed because of nonviolence. But it didn't succeed because of armed resistance either. It didn't succeed because of white liberals or because of black militants, because of bougie blacks or because of country niggas. It succeeded because of all of that. It succeeded because of people. And people are more than just the ideology they espouse. And this is why the online left is so cooked and why I said 2 years ago, I am done with it. I am convinced that the vast majority of self-identified-ist of all shapes, sizes, and creeds have never actually practiced their isms outside of a subreddit, because some of the takes y'all come with are goofier than a Disney short, man. In one of my first videos, I made the argument that ideology is the new religion. Everyone is so dogmatically devoted to their ism of choice that we spend more time defending its efficacy than actually putting it into practice, much less cooperating with people who don't see exactly the way that we do. I think too many people want to prove that they have the answer before the question is even asked. But the thing is, none of us have the answer, because we would have solved the problem now, wouldn't we? And I mean, that's how the real world works, man. And to be honest, that's why I think a lot of people avoid it and just settle on proselytizing to people who've already been converted, preaching to the choir, so to speak. If that analogy was too left field, what I'm saying is some of y'all need to read fewer books and start talking to more people because the revolution ain't going to be live streamed if it ever happens at all at this point. And if and when it does happen, it won't be with the bang that a lot of y'all are waiting for. It's going to be with a whisper. It's going to be a barbershop debate between a Garveyite and a militant, a college grad and a high school dropout. People are messy. People are complicated. People change, man, which is what makes people perfect for addressing the problems of a messy, complicated, and ever-changing world. Much more so than dogmatic devotion to ideology they are. And I'm not saying to abandon your personal ideology, and I'm not telling you have to ally with people who mean you harm, because again, duh, nigga. Much less am I saying to ally yourself with people who've already done you harm. But if the beef between you and the nigga in the other chair is basically the difference between boxers and briefs, then shut up and listen instead of raising your voice so loud as to drown theirs out. That's how movements, that's how the civil rights era worked. When people listen to each other long enough to realize that we're all basically saying the same thing, just in a different dialect. But that don't mean to stop talking. What I'm saying is some of y'all need to log the F off, man, and go to a barbershop or go to a pool house or a hairdresser, a church, something other than the internet, for God's sake. Somewhere where honest to God human beings are, flesh and blood people, and not just regurgitated thoughts of a dead man or woman, because ideology can't save the world. The people who practice it, however, can do that. Or maybe they can, nigga. I don't know. That's kind of the point of this video, right? Whatever. Bye.
Just give me 5, 6 more down.